Kids seem to have endless amounts of energy and curiosity, and one of the ways that we harness that with our son is to bring him into the kitchen and let him participate in daily cooking activities, and he loves cooking. So normally he's on a step stool or on a chair, but I thought I could do something a little bit better than that, and that's what this is all about. It's basically a glorified kids step stool with some safety features added to it. That's what we came up with here. Arts and crafts design with a decent hardwood, happens to be cherry. You can use any wood you like. Knockdown joinery, so we can take it apart if you need to. And it's something that really grows with the child. You start at the highest level and work your way down. And if you've got multiple kids at different heights, you can accommodate all of them. So you got this little platform here that simply slides in and sits down on the rails. And that's pretty much it. Now let's talk a little bit about the joinery and how we actually make it. Each side of the learning tower comes off and you've got this one-piece unit. This is a frame that's glued together, does not come apart, but you can see it's nice and flat, so it would be easy to store. This is connected to the other side via the horizontal rails, and that's where the knockdown joinery comes in. Let me show you the details. So what we've got here are two tenons and then a knockdown joinery with a threaded insert here in the middle. Basically the tenons go into mortises in the sides. There's a hole drilled, and that hole is big enough to take a bolt that goes all the way through. And that bolt goes into this threaded insert. So between the two mortise and tenon joints and a threaded insert, this is a really strong joint that just happens to be able to come apart. Now you can see I use domino joinery here because it's quick, it's easy, and I can feel good about the work that I do, even though it's fast. If you don't have a domino joiner, consider using dowels. Traditional dowels will work really well in this application, and if you want a permanent solution, you could always use pocket screws to connect these things. Now when using the domino or even dowels, the joinery tends to go pretty quickly, so once your stock is milled up, you sort of just point and shoot and things get assembled, so hold on to your butts. All of my stock gets milled up at once, jointing one face, one edge, and then planing to 3/4 of an inch in thickness. Using a stop block, I cut the parts to length at the chop saw. The platform is 16 3/4 of an inch wide, so I'll glue up a few boards and get the width I need. I like to add glue to both sides of the joint when I do a panel glue up. I start with 3 clamps, trying to keep the boards level with one another. I then add 2 more clamps facing the other way to help balance the pressure and prevent cupping. You can also use a piece of scrap as a caul to help keep the panel flat. Now to cut some joinery. I find it easiest to put layout marks on all of my pieces based on the dimensions provided in the plans. Once you have your legs laid out, simply line up your other legs and transfer those marks. No need to measure multiple times. I can then line up my various parts and strategize the placement of the joints. Your placement will obviously vary depending on the type of joinery that you use. Now I'll make all of my domino mortise cuts. The domino works like a router, making small mortises of precise dimension, and to be honest, it's kinda like woodworking on easy mode. With a special attachment, I can make the cuts into the narrow dividers safely. Let's do a quick test fit. That looks pretty good to me. Some of the mortises need to go into the face of the board, and for those, I'll use my bench vise to hold the piece securely. Now the rear bottom rail is located further in from the edge than the other rails, so I can't use the domino's fence. Instead, I'll use a thin piece of scrap as a fence and plunge right into the face of the board. The 4 front and back rails will each receive a knockdown bolt on each side. I'll drill a hole through the legs between the 2 mortises. The hole should be large enough for the bolt to travel through unhindered. Be sure to use a backer board to help prevent tear out on the other side of the workpiece, and drill all the holes for a total of 8. Now we need to do a dry assembly so that we can locate the holes in the adjoining rails. The rail receives a threaded insert to accept the bolt, so I'll use the insert itself to help me set the depth of the drill bit. By the way, this is the same bit that we used to drill the previous hole in the side. Drill all 8 bolt locations before disassembling again. Each front and back rail should now have a starter hole which will widen using a 13/32 of an inch bit. Threaded inserts don't work as well in end grain as they do in face grain, so this slightly wider hole makes it easier for me to thread the insert in without damaging the board. The key here is to keep the insert as straight as possible as it cuts its way down into the hole. Now back the insert out and add some epoxy to the hole. My hope is that the epoxy will help lock the insert in place permanently, reinforcing its hold in the end grain. Feel free to drizzle some epoxy around the insert too, just for good measure. Just be extremely careful not to get any epoxy into the inner threads. By the way, if your epoxy isn't as thin as mine, you should try West Systems. It's a great epoxy for woodworkers. Now let's cut the taper in the legs. I draw the taper 2 inches in from the top down to the outer corner of the bottom. I'll cut as close to the line as I can at the bandsaw and then clean up the edge at the jointer. The top of each leg gets a decorative rounding as well, and I'll use a little circle template to mark it out. It's not much material, so a little sanding does the job. All of the large horizontal rails receive a curve, so I'll measure up 3/4 of an inch at the center of each board and then trace the shape using my drawing bow. The cuts are made at the bandsaw. And a flexible sanding strip does the final shaping and smoothing of the curves. Now we can do some assembly. The side assemblies will be glued permanently, so I'll do one at a time. The side rails and dividers are glued into one leg first, and then the other leg is added on. To apply even clamping pressure to the angled edges, we'll need some angled cauls. The cutoff pieces from the previous taper cuts are perfect for this. They'll both cancel out the taper angle while also protecting the cherry from denting. Once the glue is dry, I give the side assemblies a nice sanding to even out the joints and smooth the surface. Now for the rails with the knockdown joints, we have to do something a little bit different. We'll glue the tenons into the rail only. The other side of the even though they're dry, these tenons will still lend an incredible amount of strength and stability to the structure. For the rest of the construction, we'll want to have this thing assembled, so let's test out those knockdown joints. As the bolts are tightened, the whole stand becomes incredibly sturdy. Well, now we can cut our platform to size, and this is one of those things you want to do later on in the project because cumulative error and just little mistakes that you make here and there could result in the dimensions being different than the plan. So this is something we want to cut after the fact. Just take measurements and make sure it's pretty close. If it's different from the plan, then you make the adjustment. I'll use my crosscut sled to cut the panel to size and square it up. Now I cut my platform about 1/8 of an inch less than the opening, and that should make it a little bit easier to slide this guy in place. There we go. With the platform cut to final size, I mark the length on the trim pieces and cut them to final length. Since the trim creates a 1/2 inch lip above and below the panel, I'll use some 1/2 inch thick strips to prop the panel up for gluing. This long grain glue joint really doesn't need any additional reinforcement to do its job. And now for the support cleats. Some of these will get a nice taper, which is mostly for looks, but it also provides a little bit of extra headroom when sliding that platform in and out. Each cleat gets a nice round over before being attached to the dividers. I'm only putting glue on the cleat side for convenience, so I add a little bit extra. I place the cleat so it's flush with the side divider and butts up against the front divider. A piece of scrap prevents dents, and a quick clamp holds everything together while I bring the big boy clamps in. All 6 cleats are attached the same way. Alright, so the fit is pretty snug. If you think you're going to move this around a lot, maybe you have multiple kids so you're going to change levels a lot, you may want to trim it down just a little bit shorter to make it easier to pull in and out. For me, I've got 1 kid and I don't anticipate moving this very often. The fit that I have is pretty good. Now we do have to talk about a safety issue here. When you're climbing up on this side, it tends to want to lift up the front, so we do need to add something to prevent that from happening. And I think some dowel pins should do the trick. They'll be removable, but while they're in place, it'll be nice and secure. And we'll drill those later, but for now I want to grab a pencil and I want to mark the locations so I can get that dowel pin registered in just the right spot. So I marked out each level, and now we can disassemble, drill the holes, and do some finishing touches. I love using this tiny router for things like roundovers. For the front and back rails and dividers, I'll use the router table. Anything I couldn't reach with the router bit gets hit with some sandpaper. And of course, a final sanding with 220 grit. Before calling it done, I'm adding a few screws to each cleat for extra reinforcement since the cleats bear most of the weight. Now finishing this project is going to be a piece of cake because the parts don't have to go together yet. It's sort of like pre-finishing, so everything is nice and flat, so it's going to be super easy to apply the finish. Now what finish do you use? Well, you've got a decision to make. A piece like this is going to get used and abused, kind of like your workbench, right? So when you have something in that situation, you have two choices. You either protect the heck out of it with a thick film finish, or you go the other way and you provide a little bit of protection, but something that's a very easily renewable finish. So for this, I'm going to go with a Danish oil. Danish oil is an oil varnish blend. There's a little bit of varnish in there. That's going to provide some protection, but if it gets dinged and scratched, which it surely will, all I have to do is sand a little bit, clean it up, and then wipe on some new finish, and it should be good to go. Now, the Danish oil I'm going to use is actually Watco teak oil. It's an outdoor formulation of Danish oil, and the reason I'm using it is because I've got it, and I don't feel like going out and buying something else when this stuff will actually work for this project. But normally the Watco Danish oil is perfectly fine for this, all right? So really easy to apply. I'm just gonna get a rag and we'll get to work. I always pour my finishes into a secondary container in order to limit the amount of time the original can is open. It also prevents contamination, which is always nice. There are a few different schools of thought for applying an oil varnish blend like this. My preferred method is to apply it sparingly, rubbing it aggressively into the surface. The following day, I apply a second coat. And this one goes on easier and spreads much faster, but I'm still wiping it on very thin. The following day, I give the entire piece a light buffing with a 2000 grit sanding pad, making it smooth as silk. Now for the final assembly. It can be tricky to get all of those tenons into their mortises, but with a little bit of patience, they all hit home. All right, this looks pretty good. Now the finish is easily repairable. If we get a ding or a scratch at some point, we could just come back with some fine grit sandpaper, remove the scratch or blemish, and then just come back with a little bit of Danish oil, rub it in nice and light, reapply it, let it dry, and bring it back in the house. Now you might be wondering at this point, how strong is knockdown joinery? Knockdown joinery isn't something I do very often. Most times I want my furniture to stay together forever. This is something that the knockdown just kind of makes sense. So how strong is it, right? Because there's no glue in some of those joints. So I don't know. Let's see. If it can hold me, I think it'll be okay. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't take my shoes off. All right, here we go. There's probably a better way to do this. How about I just go over the top? So clearly it can support a decent amount of weight, but what about racking forces, right? If you push sort of, imagine collapsing this thing on a diagonal, push that way, there's no movement whatsoever, all right? There's enough support there with the four rails that there's absolutely no racking going on. This is nice and strong. So let's take it in the house and let the kid have a test run.